Have you ever felt like you were living a life that isn't fully yours? Like you're playing a role written by someone else, smiling, achieving, surviving, but deep down, something sacred is missing. Maybe you've done everything right, and still, there's a quiet ache, a restlessness in your chest, a question that keeps whispering late at night. Is this all there is? What if I told you that this ache isn't a flaw, but a call from your soul, a spiritual alarm clock set by the universe itself, inviting you to wake up, not to do more but to become more you. This isn't about religion, it's not about philosophy, it's about a sacred truth that psychology, mysticism, and the wisdom of Jung all point toward. The life you're meant to live doesn't begin until you finally meet yourself. In this video, we're going to explore what no one ever told you about the second half of life, a phase often misunderstood as decline, when in truth, it's your rebirth. You'll discover why everything before your 40s is just preparation, research for the journey that truly matters, the journey back to your essence. We'll reveal why the midlife crisis is not a collapse, but a cosmic initiation, why your dreams, your fears, your inner conflicts, and even your silence are trying to guide you back to yourself, to the person you were before the world told you who to be. This isn't just a video, it's a portal, a symbolic key to unlock everything your soul already knows, but your mind forgot. If you've ever felt disconnected from your purpose, alienated from your truth, or exhausted by the noise of the world, this is for you. And if this message stirs something inside you, don't leave without subscribing to Celestial Truths. A lot of people watch our videos without subscribing, but if you're on this journey, you belong here. Activate the notifications and stay with us till the end, because what we're about to uncover could change not only the way you see your life, but the way you live it. There comes a moment, often unnoticed at first, when the rhythm of life begins to shift. It's not marked by fireworks or grand announcements. It's quieter, like a whisper from the depths of the soul. Jung believed that the first 40 years are not wasted time, but rather sacred preparation. Think of them as the initial sketch of a vast spiritual painting, a cosmic draft. These years are the phase where the universe lets us taste the external world, so we can later return to ourselves with deeper hunger. It's when we play roles, chase ideals, collect titles. But these pursuits, though loud, rarely satisfy the silent call echoing within. The universe doesn't rush us. It watches patiently as we explore, falter, and rise again, knowing that at the turn of 40, something ancient begins to stir, the call to truly live. Imagine the soul as a tree. In the early seasons, it stretches toward the sun, growing leaves of ambition and bark of identity. But after 40, the roots begin their sacred descent. Jung saw this as the inward path, the beginning of the true self's emergence. Until then, life is largely adaptation, molding ourselves to society, family, and image. We become experts at being what the world expects. But deep beneath the self, that sacred, silent core has been observing, waiting for the moment when the noise lessens enough for its voice to be heard. And when it does, it doesn't speak in commands. It speaks in dreams, in aches, in a sudden yearning for meaning, for depth, for truth. Spirituality begins to blossom here, not in rejection of the outer world, but as a longing to reunite with the mystical harmony of the universe that we forgot we were part of. This phase is often accompanied by disillusionment, a feeling that the outer achievements, though once thrilling, no longer nourish. It's the beginning of what ancient mystics called the second birth. You begin to realize that knowledge is not wisdom, success is not, fulfillment and identity is not essence. The spiritual journey that begins after 40 isn't about escape, but about return, a return to something original, sacred, and deeply personal. This is when one begins to see life not just as a series of events, but as a web of symbols, synchronicities, and archetypes, each reflecting a facet of your unconscious landscape. Suddenly, the universe isn't random. It becomes poetic, meaningful. You may notice the same number repeating, a phrase someone says that echoes your thoughts, or a dream that lingers like a prophecy. These are not coincidences. These are conversations with the deeper realms of your psyche. In this sacred threshold, it becomes clear that our early years were not a mistake or a detour. They were a map being drawn in invisible ink. All the heartbreaks, confusions, and detours were sacred teachers, sculpting the psyche for the awakening to come. To live spiritually is not to deny your past, but to see it illuminated by the light of inner wisdom. Jung taught that the unconscious is not a dungeon of chaos, but a well of forgotten truths. By age 40, if you listen closely, you'll start hearing your name being called from that well. Not the name society gave you, but the one the stars whispered when your soul first chose to descend into matter. That's when you begin to remember who you truly are. And yet, this is only the beginning. The realization that the outer world cannot define your essence is not an end. It is the sacred doorway to individuation. The spiritual shift that begins around 40 is like standing before an ancient gate, covered in symbols you're only just beginning to understand. You don't need to force it open. You simply need to recognize that the key was always within. As the old desires fade, a deeper longing arises, not for possession but for connection, not for image but for truth, not for noise but for silence. And in that silence, the universe speaks, not in words, but in feeling, in resonance, in spiritual remembering. The journey has only just begun, and with it we step into the next mystery, the so-called midlife crisis, which is, in truth, the soul's most urgent invitation to awaken. What the world often labels as a crisis, the soul knows as a calling. Around the middle of life, something begins to unravel. Not because you're breaking down, but because you're breaking open. Carl Jung, in his infinite spiritual insight, recognized that what we call a midlife crisis is, in fact, the moment the soul knocks on the door of consciousness, asking to be let in. Society may whisper that you're too old to start over, but the universe has a different rhythm, one that honors cycles, initiations, and rebirth. And so in this phase, the questions become louder than the answers. The laughter feels more distant. The career that once made sense starts to feel hollow. It's not madness. It's a mystical shift, a sacred turbulence that shakes the false self until the real one emerges from within. During this awakening, many feel lost, as if the map they've been following suddenly vanished. But that loss is not punishment, it's an invitation. The universe, in its strange and poetic way, often has to remove the scaffolding of illusion so we can see the sky of truth. You might begin to wonder, why am I here? What's the point of all this? These are not signs of weakness, they are signs of readiness. Spirituality finds fertile ground here, because it is in the cracks of identity that the light enters. The mystical experience isn't reserved for saints and sages. It's available to anyone who dares to sit in silence and listen to what the universe has been trying to say all along. The so-called crisis is merely the soul remembering what it came here to do. As roles begin to crumble, the role of the provider, the achiever, the perfect parent, space is created for the emergence of something deeper, the self. Jung described this process as the return to wholeness, a reintegration of all that had been ignored, hidden, or abandoned. It's no longer enough to chase validation or cling to outdated dreams. You start to sense that there's a deeper intelligence guiding you, through intuition, through symbols, through the mystical echoes of the unconscious. You may find yourself drawn to forgotten passions, childhood dreams, or even strange synchronicities that seem to nudge you toward a new direction. This isn't fantasy. It's the language of the soul, the universe speaking in metaphor and emotion. Many people fear this passage because it feels like dying. And in a way, it is. But not the death of life, the death of illusion. The person you thought you had to be begins to dissolve, and what emerges isn't weaker, it's truer. There's grief, yes, but also liberation. The old scripts stop working, and for the first time, you're handed a blank page. What will you write now? Who will you become when no one is watching? The spiritual path invites you to surrender control, to let go of what you should be, and to listen, truly listen, to what your soul has been whispering through the noise. The mystical isn't outside of you, it's in every breath, every dream, every pause that feels like stillness but holds the entire cosmos within it. So let us not call this a crisis. Let us call it what it truly is, an initiation, a sacred rebirth, the point where the ego loosens its grip and the self steps forward. slowly, vulnerably, beautifully. It may not be loud or easy. It may come in the form of restlessness, tears, or sleepless nights. But make no mistake, this is not the end. It's the universe aligning you with your essence. The moment you begin to sense that the life you've built no longer reflects who you are is not a failure. It's a signal that your inner world is waking up. And as this awakening unfolds, a deeper journey begins. The path from persona to true self, a return to the wholeness. That was always waiting in the shadow of your becoming. Since early childhood, we begin to craft a mask, one carefully shaped by expectations, survival, and belonging. Jung called it the persona, the social costume we wear to navigate the outer world. It allows us to function, to be accepted, to feel safe, but the persona is not the self. It's a necessary illusion, a performance that eventually becomes too tight for the soul to breathe. As the years pass, cracks begin to form. Moments of silence start feeling sacred. Old ambitions feel foreign. You begin to sense that the person you've been isn't the full truth of who you are. It's just the part that knew how to be seen. And this realization, this subtle ache, is the universe calling you inward, inviting you to shed the surface and descend into something far more eternal. The journey of individuation isn't a straight road. It's a spiral, winding through memories, dreams, fears, and forgotten joys. It's a descent into the underworld of your psyche, a sacred pilgrimage into the hidden temple of the soul. This is where spirituality becomes not just a belief, but a lived experience. You start recognizing that the universe doesn't operate in linear logic, but in symbols, synchronicities, and mirrors. Conversations hit deeper. Dreams feel more vivid. You begin to question not just your life, but your very identity. And it's terrifying, because the persona feels safe, even if it's limiting. But beneath it lies the self, wild, whole, honest. The mystica of the human experience is precisely this: to die before dying, to awaken from the persona and remember the soul. During individuation, the unconscious becomes your guide, not an enemy to be conquered, but a wise companion with ancient knowledge. Symbols start speaking louder than words. You might find yourself pulled towards certain books, places, or people without knowing why. You may have dreams of water, mirrors, or long journeys. These aren't random. They're sacred signs, expressions of your inner universe. Through journaling, meditation, or quietly watching your life unfold, you'll begin to sense patterns that repeat not by accident, but by spiritual design. The self doesn't shout. It speaks softly through the mystical winds of your daily life, always inviting, never forcing. There's a certain grief in letting go of the persona. After all, you've lived inside it for so long. But there's also an unspeakable freedom. Imagine removing a mask and feeling sunlight on skin that's never been touched. That's what becoming yourself feels like. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. This isn't a rejection of the outer world, but a realignment. Spirituality is no longer an external search. It becomes an inner sanctuary. You start asking different questions. Not, how do they see me? But, how does my soul see me? Not, what should I do? But, what wants to emerge from within me? And in that space, the mystical energy of the universe begins to respond, not with control, but with flow. The more you align with your true self, the more everything around you begins to shift. Relationships transform, desires simplify, time slows down. You may find that even silence feels rich, because you're no longer trying to fill the void, but listening to it. This is individuation, the slow, sacred unfolding of your original essence. And it's not a destination, it's a lifelong dance between the conscious and the unconscious, between light and shadow, between what you were and what you're becoming. As this deep inner alchemy begins to take root, the next layer awaits. And that layer is darker, deeper, but no less divine. The encounter with the shadow, the hidden twin of the self, and the keeper of your most powerful truths. Every light casts a shadow, and the deeper the light, the darker the shadow it creates. Carl Jung, with the clarity of a soul that had wandered beyond the surface, understood that the path to wholeness demands we turn and face what we've buried. The shadow is not a monster to be slayed. It's a forgotten part of you, waiting to be seen. It holds your rage, your shame, your fears, but also your passion, your creativity, and your truth. It's not evil, it's simply rejected. And around the midpoint of life, the universe stops letting you ignore it. The distractions lose their taste, the masks fall apart, and there it is, staring. Back at you in your relationships, your emotional triggers, your restless dreams. The spiritual journey asks not that you escape it, but that you sit beside it and listen. To face the shadow is to walk into the sacred cave of the unconscious, a place where logic dims and symbols rise. You may feel overwhelmed. You may resist. That's natural. The ego wants order. The shadow brings chaos. But chaos is fertile. From the soil of confusion grows clarity. From discomfort comes transformation. Spirituality doesn't promise peace without pain. It promises meaning within it. When you feel jealous, irritable, defensive, pause. Ask, whose voice is this? What part of me was never allowed to exist? This is where the mystical practice of shadow work begins, through dream journaling, inner dialogue, meditative self-confrontation. It's not glamorous, but it's holy. The universe doesn't just live in the stars. It lives in your wounds, waiting to become light. This is not about judgment. It's about integration. Jung taught that we do not become whole by chasing perfection, but by embracing contradiction. You are both light and dark. The shadow appears not just in nightmares, but in projection. The people you hate, the things that irritate you, often carry pieces of yourself you've disowned. Seeing this requires courage, the courage to stop blaming the world and start excavating your soul. And when you do, when you finally sit in silence and let the hidden voices speak, something begins to shift. The mystical veil thins. You start to dream differently. You feel a spiritual tremor within, as if the universe is acknowledging your honesty. And it is, because when you face your shadow, you're no longer fragmented, you're becoming whole. There's beauty in the darkness if you know how to look. The shadow is the guardian of your soul's vitality. It holds the emotions you never expressed, the talents you were too afraid to show, the truths that scared others away. When these are embraced, not acted out, but honored, the soul begins to sing again. You stop living in reaction and start living in awareness. Spirituality becomes embodied, not as a concept, but as a lived truth. You walk through the world no longer trying to be only light, but as a living constellation of everything you are. The mystical universe doesn't reward those who hide from themselves. It embraces those who dare to see clearly. And as this deep inner reckoning begins to settle, another shift quietly arrives. The questions change. The cravings for status or success lose their pull. Something softer, yet more powerful, begins to rise. A longing not for things, but for essence. Not for control, but for connection. The next step in the journey unfolds. A reorientation of desire. It's no longer about what do I want to have, but who am I here to become? A deeper spiritual compass begins to emerge, and the search for meaning takes center stage. At a certain point in the soul's evolution, the questions begin to shift. They lose a brilio of the material and start echoing with existential weight. No longer is the focus on acquisitions, achievements, or status. Instead, a quieter, more mystical inquiry arises from within. Who am I beneath it all? This change doesn't happen suddenly. It's often sparked by disillusionment, a hollow promotion, a relationship that fades, a goal that no longer inspires. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, begins to redirect your gaze, not outward but inward. Spirituality enters not as an escape, but as a necessity. What once seemed important now feels like noise, and in the silence, a new compass begins to turn. This is the true alchemy of midlife, not a crisis of loss, but a sacred return to being. The human experience, when viewed through the lens of Jungian psychology and Mystica Universal, reveals that our early desires are often echoes of societal programming. We chase what we were taught to want, believing that to have is to be. But when the soul awakens, it asks something else entirely. It no longer wants to possess, it wants to embody, not to gather titles, but to become truth. You begin asking, what makes me feel alive? What brings me peace when no one is watching? These are not luxury questions. They are survival questions of the spirit. This is where the true work begins. the work of redefining purpose, not through productivity, but through presence. Imagine a life where your calendar isn't filled with obligations but aligned with your inner rhythm, where your success isn't measured in applause, but in integrity. That is the shift the universe invites you to make, a sacred pivot from ego to essence. It's not about abandoning your goals, but about asking whose goals they are. Were they planted by your soul or imposed by fear and conformity? This inquiry is the seed of liberation. Through reflective writing, long walks in silence, symbolic meditation, and the observation of synchronicities, you start to hear the voice beneath the noise, the self, gently reclaiming space. Jung understood that the question, "Who do I want to be?" is not a philosophical game. It is the doorway to the individuation process. And this doorway doesn't open with ambition. It opens with surrender. You begin to feel drawn to authenticity like a moth to flame, unable to tolerate masks, shallow conversations, or anything that doesn't feel real. Even relationships change, not because others are wrong, but because your inner frequency is shifting. The universe begins to echo this change. Old paths close, new ones emerge. Symbols, dreams, even strangers become messengers, and you begin to walk not in certainty, but in trust. The path may be unclear, but the self knows the way. And as this sacred reorientation unfolds, a quiet revolution begins inside you. You start to understand that the real measure of a life well lived is not what you built, but who you became. That the most valuable currency is presence. That your existence is not random. It's a mystical thread woven into the great tapestry of the universe. The question, "Who do I want to be?" doesn't demand an immediate answer. It invites a lifetime of listening. And with that listening, the next phase reveals itself. A beautiful unraveling of old identities, a surrender of expectations, and a gentle descent into the freedom of becoming. There comes a sacred moment in every seeker's path when the walls of identity begin to tremble. Not because you've failed, but because something deeper is ready to rise. The life you built, the roles, expectations, and polished image starts to feel like a beautiful cage, and the soul, no longer willing to trade authenticity for acceptance, begins to rattle the bars. This is not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough, a mystical dismantling. The universe, in its silent wisdom, begins to remove what no longer serves, gently, sometimes violently, to make space for who you truly are. The process can be terrifying, yes, but underneath the fear is freedom. Spirituality here becomes a lifeline, not as dogma, but as remembrance. You're not becoming someone new. You're remembering the self you buried beneath should. We've all been shaped by stories, told how to behave, what to want, who to become. These scripts, though meant to protect, often become prisons. The voice of the inner child gets drowned by the noise of obligation. You start to feel the tension between what the world expects and what your soul desires. This tension isn't wrong, it's sacred. It's the spiritual pressure of rebirth. Jung understood this well. Real transformation isn't about adding more, it's about shedding. The mystica lies in the release, letting go of the image, letting go of the performance, letting go of the version of yourself built to survive. What remains is raw, tender, real, and in that rawness, the universe finally has room to breathe through you. This is where the inner work deepens. You begin to identify which dreams were yours and which were inherited. You notice which parts of your personality are authentic and which were merely coping strategies. Through tools like reflective journaling, archetypal visualization, dream interpretation, and quiet moments with the self, you begin to unweave the old fabric. It's not quick work. It's sacred deconstruction. Spirituality reveals itself not in lightning bolts, but in slow, steady unraveling. The more you let go, the more you realize you were never broken, just buried under layers of expectation. The mystical universe never forgot who you are. It's been waiting for you to remember. Of course, letting go comes with grief. You grieve the old identity, the relationships that no longer fit, the approval that used to matter. But in that grief, there's also space, spaciousness to breathe, to feel, to reimagine. You may find yourself craving simplicity, real conversations, honest silence, the smell of earth, the touch of the wind. These aren't escapes, they're returns, to essence, to presence, to truth. Jung's teachings remind us that the soul doesn't want perfection, it wants wholeness, and wholeness only comes when you stop trying to become someone and start allowing yourself to be. And so, as the illusions fall away and the shoulds dissolve into silence, you stand at the edge of something vast. There's no map now, only intuition. The ego resists this, but the soul rejoices. You begin to feel lighter, not because you have less, but because you are less entangled, less conditioned, less afraid. In this sacred simplicity, a new desire arises, not to impress, but to express, not to climb, but to connect. And with this inner liberation, the next layer of the journey reveals itself, the quest for self-realization, not as ambition, but as truth lived. There comes a time when the hunger for external validation begins to dissolve, like fog under the rising sun. What once felt urgent, status, success, applause, now feels strangely empty, and in that quiet, something far more ancient emerges, the longing to be whole. Jung called this self-realization, the sacred act of becoming who you truly are, not who the world trained you to be. It's not about reaching higher, it's about going deeper. The path is no longer about competition or climbing, it's about alignment. Spirituality becomes embodied here, not as an escape from life, but as the very core of living. You stop striving to be more and start surrendering to what is. And in that surrender, you find everything you were looking for. Ambition often comes from the wounded ego, the part of us trying to prove we're worthy. But self-realization comes from the soul. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It says, be still, listen. There's nothing to earn. There's only something to remember. The mystical journey invites you to step off the treadmill of achievement and into the flow of authenticity. This doesn't mean abandoning action. It means letting action rise from essence. You no longer push, you align. You no longer chase, you magnetize. The universe begins to respond in subtler ways. A dream that reveals truth, a conversation that feels fated, a moment of stillness that shifts your entire being. These are not coincidences. They are signs that you are living in resonance with your inner truth. As you align with the self, your life begins to simplify, not in form, but in frequency. You stop trying to please. You stop explaining yourself. You begin to value depth over noise, presence over performance. Jung saw this shift as the movement from ego consciousness to a deeper awareness of the self, a sacred center that connects you to the collective soul of the universe. You feel less separate, less rushed, less interested in control. The mystical enters through daily moments, a gaze, a breath, a pause. You realize the universe was never outside of you. It was always within, quietly waiting for space to speak, and now you're finally listening. This is not about passivity, it's about power. A new kind of power, one that doesn't need dominance to exist. A power rooted in truth, in coherence, in peace. Self-realization is the flame that doesn't burn but illuminates. It's not loud, but it transforms. You begin to walk differently, not because you've figured it all out, but because you've stopped pretending you need to. The spiritual path becomes a pathless path, guided not by goals but by inner knowing. You start to serve something greater than ambition. You serve your essence, and in doing so, you serve the world. Because the world needs more souls who are alive in their truth. And so, as the old fire of ambition fades into embers, a new light rises from within, steady, sacred, quiet. It is the light of someone who is no longer searching to become, but simply being. And in this being, everything finds its place. You begin to see others with softer eyes. You listen more. You rush less. And in this inner spaciousness, a new kind of freedom emerges, the freedom to just exist as you are. But this is not the end. There is still more to unfold. Because as you grow into yourself, something unexpected blooms, an emotional maturity that brings with it the most subtle yet profound liberation of all, the freedom to simply be. There is a quiet power that emerges with time, not the kind that conquers, but the kind that allows. Emotional maturity is not about controlling feelings, but about honoring them without becoming them. It is the spiritual realization that you no longer need to react, perform, or prove. You simply are. And that being, grounded, centered, present, becomes your sanctuary. Jung often spoke of the terrifying yet liberating experience of fully accepting oneself, not just the parts you show, but the hidden chambers of your heart. And in this acceptance, something ancient softens. The war within ends. The mystica of the universe begins to whisper through your breath, your body, your gaze. You feel less need to speak and more ability to listen, to others, to life, to the cosmos within. At this stage, the soul no longer seeks drama, it seeks peace. And peace is not silence, but alignment. Emotional maturity means you don't need to be understood by everyone. You don't chase approval. You don't collapse under judgment. You walk your path with gentle eyes and a clear heart. Spirituality becomes less of a quest and more of a quiet flame that burns steady. It guides you not through lightning strikes, but through intuitive nudges and sacred pauses. The universe begins to feel like an old friend, sometimes silent, sometimes poetic, but always present. And with that presence, a subtle yet profound freedom emerges. The freedom to live your truth without apology. The opinions of others no longer imprison you, not because you've grown cold, but because you've grown rooted, emotional. Maturity is like a mountain, unmoved by storms, but alive with stillness. You begin to find joy in the simple, the smell of rain, the texture of silence, the slow unfolding of a conversation that means something. You choose solitude not out of isolation, but out of reverence for your own presence. The spiritual journey becomes less about seeking and more about remembering. You remember that your worth was never negotiable, that your soul was never lost, only waiting. And now, finally, you're home. This inner freedom can't be bought or inherited. It's earned in moments of solitude, shadow work, deep breaths, and the quiet courage of self-honesty. It's in forgiving yourself, in choosing softness over performance, in realizing that being enough was never something to achieve. It was something to reclaim. Jung reminded us that the acceptance of oneself is both the most difficult and the most essential task of adulthood. And when it happens, the external world loses its grip. You stop, needing the world to reflect your value because you carry it within. And from that place, your presence becomes a blessing to yourself, to others, to the mystical dance of the universe. So, as this journey through the layers of the self unfolds, we arrive not at a final destination, but at a sacred return, a coming home to the soul. Maturity is not an end. It is a beginning of deeper joy, truer connection, and untamed spiritual clarity. You are no longer chasing purpose. You are the purpose. You walk lighter, love deeper, and live slower, not because you have less time, but because you understand the eternity in every moment. And now, as the spiral draws its circle, one final truth remains. Your freedom was never out there. It was always within you, waiting for this exact moment to be remembered. So, who are you becoming? After everything we've uncovered in this journey, the cycles, the symbols, the shadow, the truth, what inside of you has begun to shift? This isn't the end. If anything, it's the sacred beginning of your real life. I want to hear from you. What part of this message spoke to your soul? What truth did you feel, not just understand? Share your experience in the comments. Your insight might be exactly what someone else needs to awaken their own path. And if this video resonated with you, don't leave without subscribing to Celestial Truths. So many people watch without subscribing, but if you feel called to this journey, you belong here. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next layer of insight the universe is ready to show you. And now, the next video that's appearing on your screen is your invitation to go even deeper. Click it and continue remembering who you truly are. With reverence, Celestial Truths.